Shaquille O'Neal stepped into a luxurious restaurant located in the heart of the city, dressed in casual clothes with a few wrinkles, looking as if he had just gone through an ordinary day. He chose a small, discreet table, trying not to draw attention, as the sparkling light from the crystal chandeliers illuminated the space around him. However, before he could even place an order, a waitress approached him with a contemptuous look and an air of arrogance. She sneered, "Are you sure you can afford to dine here?" Her words, sharp and laced with insinuation, were loud enough for other diners to hear. What happened next not only left everyone in the restaurant stunned, but also revealed a truth that changed everything. Before we continue the story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Beverly Hills, where every corner sparkles with the glow of opulence, is home to La Lumere, a renowned restaurant known as a symbol of class and sophistication. Tonight, sleek sports cars lined up outside, and customers stepped out in flowing silk gowns and impeccably tailored suits. The light from the crystal chandeliers inside reflected through the glass doors, creating a dreamlike scene. The glass doors of Lumere opened gently, and a towering figure entered, immediately drawing every gaze. Shaquille O'Neal, over 7 feet tall, walked into the restaurant at a slow, deliberate pace. Unlike the regular clientele of La Lumere, Shaq wore a simple gray t-shirt, comfortable sweatpants, and a pair of worn-out sneakers. In a place where brand names were personal statements, Shaq's simplicity was a striking contrast. The diners near the entrance stole glances at him. Some recognized Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball legend who once dominated the NBA. But here, amidst the formal atmosphere of La Lumere, his appearance seemed out of place. A few murmurs began to ripple through the tables. At the reception desk, Emma, a young waitress, stood poised in her pristine uniform. Her hair was tied up in a neat bun, not a single strand out of place. Her smile was professionally polite, but her eyes betrayed a certain arrogance. Having worked at La Lumere for years, Emma took pride in her position at Beverly Hills' most prestigious restaurant. However, her pride often came with a tendency to quickly judge others by their appearance. When Emma's eyes landed on Shaq, she couldn't hide her displeasure. She quickly scanned his athletic attire, then raised an eyebrow slightly, with a judgmental gaze. She thought to herself, "Someone like this doesn't belong here." Though she was a waitress, Emma often saw herself as a gatekeeper of Lumere's elegance. In her mind, guests needed to exude appropriateness in every detail, from their clothes to their demeanor. The tall man standing before her, she doubted he could afford a meal here, let alone blend into this refined setting. Shaq, seemingly oblivious to the stares or Emma's attitude, approached the reception desk. He smiled, his deep voice calm and warm. "Good evening. I'd like to book a table if there's one available." Emma hesitated briefly at the politeness in his tone, but quickly regained her air of superiority. She smirked and replied with a condescending tone, "Good evening, but this is a fine dining establishment. Are you sure you want to eat here?" Shaq looked her straight in the eye, his light smile unwavering. "Yes, I'd like to try dining here," he said, his voice steady. Emma rolled her eyes slightly, but maintained her surface-level professionalism. "All right, let me check the table availability. Please wait for a moment." She turned away, but her thoughts raced. This guy isn't going to last long here. Let's see how he reacts when he sees the menu prices. Shaquille O'Neal, who had faced immense pressure on the basketball court countless times, stood calmly, casually observing the lavish ambience of La Lumere. The golden light from the chandeliers bathed his face, reflecting his composed, confident gaze. He didn't say another word, but his unbothered demeanor only heightened the curiosity of those around him. Tonight, Shaq had entered a world of glamour, but he didn't belong to it. Or rather, he was about to challenge the rigid prejudices built within this very world. Emma walked out from behind the reception desk with an air of barely concealed arrogance.
She had worked at La Lumere long enough to believe she was the ultimate authority on the class this restaurant represented. In her eyes, Shaq with his simple tracksuit and calm demeanor was utterly out of place. "Are you sure you want to eat here? This is a fine dining establishment," she said, her voice laced with mockery, her gaze lingering on Shaq's worn sneakers before settling on his face. Her smile was thinly veiled disdain, her tone loud enough for nearby diners to overhear. Shaq, well acquainted with judgmental looks and dismissive words, simply smiled. He met Emma's gaze squarely, his eyes steady and unflinching. "Yes, I'd like to try the experience here," he replied, his voice calm and polite, so composed it rendered her sarcasm almost meaningless. But Emma wasn't deterred. Tilting her head, her lips curved into a half-smile, she seemed intent on making him uncomfortable. She turned with an exaggerated grace, her movements teetering on the edge of being a performance, and spoke over her shoulder, "Follow me. I'll find a seat suitable for you." Emma led Shaq through the vibrant heart of the restaurant, where tables were immaculately set under the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. The diners exuded an air of sophistication and confidence, engaged in lively conversations. Yet Emma didn't stop at any of these prime spots. Instead, she continued walking, guiding Shaq toward the farthest corner of the restaurant, where the lighting dimmed and the atmosphere felt markedly less refined. Stopping at a table near the kitchen where the clatter of dishes and faint traces of food aromas lingered, Emma turned around, her face plastered with a false smile. "This spot should match your style perfectly," she said, dropping the menu onto the table with a light thud, loud enough to draw glances from nearby diners. Shaq nodded, offering no reaction. He sat down, his smile unwavering, his eyes calm as if everything unfolding around him had no power to disturb his peace. But Emma wasn't satisfied. She wanted to see him flustered, embarrassed, or better yet, leave altogether. Yet Shaq's unraveled demeanor left her increasingly irritated. She turned on her heel and walked away, but not without adding, loud enough for the nearby tables, "Hope you enjoy this spot. Not everyone gets such a prime seat." The nearby diners began murmuring among themselves. A few sympathetic glances were cast in Shaq's direction, while others watched with curiosity. A young woman, Lisa, shook her head and whispered to her dining companion, "She's so rude. He didn't do anything wrong." Meanwhile, at the central table, bathed in the restaurant's soft glow, an older couple, Mr. and Mrs. Carter, observed the situation. Mr. Carter, a distinguished man with silver hair, sipped his wine and murmured to his wife, "He's impressively composed. Most people would have reacted by now." Back at the reception desk, Emma smirked, pleased with what she thought was her solution to the problem. In her mind, Shaq couldn't possibly last long here. Yet even as she relished her perceived victory, an invisible unease began to ripple through the restaurant. Shaq, though he had said little, left a distinct impression, not just due to his imposing presence, but because of his calm, commanding grace. Tonight, Lumere was about to become more than just a fine dining venue. It was about to serve as the stage for an unforgettable lesson. Emma stood a few steps away from Shaq's table, her eyes glancing over, as if calculating her next move to solidify her imagined authority. Her previous actions, claiming a special seat and dropping subtle insinuations, seemed insufficient to satisfy her sense of superiority. Turning back with the soft leather menu in her hand, she approached Shaq's table, deliberately, her slow steps drawing the attention of nearby diners. Placing the menu in front of Shaq, Emma leaned in, her gaze brushing over him with a mocking edge. "Would you like me to explain the prices?" she asked, her tone intentionally condescending. Her finger pointed to the corner of the menu where the restaurant's most luxurious dish was listed. "The most expensive item here is $350, she emphasized, each word her eyes locked onto Shaq's face, searching for any trace of discomfort or hesitation. Shaq, steady as a rock against a gentle wave, remained unshaken. He simply looked up, his eyes carrying a hint of amusement. "I'll have the filet mignon rossini," he said, his tone calm, as if he were ordering the simplest dish on the menu. Shaq's response caused Emma to falter briefly. She hadn't expected him to choose the most expensive dish so nonchalantly. Quickly recovering, she let out a derisive laugh, loud enough to draw the attention of other diners. "Oh, really?" Emma replied, her voice syrupy sweet, but laced with thinly veiled scorn. "I hope you know how to appreciate it. This isn't the kind of food that everyone is accustomed to." Nearby diners began whispering among themselves. A young couple at a neighboring table whispered, "She's so rude. Why would she?"
Hamilton sat quietly with her granddaughter, observing the entire scene. She sipped her tea and placed the cup down with a soft clink. "This is disgraceful," she said, her voice soft but weighty. "Waitstaff are here to serve, not to judge the customers. That young woman needs to learn a lesson." Her granddaughter, a bright-eyed young woman, leaned forward. "Do you think he's going to do anything? He's just sitting there, not saying a word." "His silence is the answer," Mrs. Hamilton replied, her tone calm. "People who truly know their worth don't need to prove it to anyone. He knows who he is, and that girl will ruin herself soon enough." Meanwhile, Emma, oblivious to the simmering discontent spreading through the room, continued to focus on her personal agenda. She spent extra time at the central tables, deliberately engaging in lengthy conversations to divert attention from what she believed might spotlight Shaq. Passing by Shaq's table once again, she didn't even glance his way, but spoke loudly enough to be heard as she conversed with a colleague. "This is why we need higher standards. Not everyone understands the sophistication required here, and clearly, not everyone belongs." Shaq, his gaze steady, glanced briefly at Emma without saying a word. There was no need to respond. There was no need to react to someone so determined to dig their own hole. Instead, he offered a faint smile and continued observing the room, where other diners had started to murmur amongst themselves. At the central table, Mr. Carter turned back to Mrs. Carter, his voice low but firm. "We need to speak to the manager immediately. This isn't just unfair, it's ruining the atmosphere for everyone." Mrs. Carter nodded, her eyes reflecting empathy for Shaq. "I hope he doesn't leave before this is resolved. He deserves respect." And so, the quiet tension in La Lumere was no longer the signature piece of a fine dining establishment. It had become a taut string stretched to its breaking point, waiting for a single spark to ignite a full-blown confrontation. Emma, smug in her actions, remained blissfully unaware that the very patrons she believed had overlooked the injustice were in fact rallying behind Shaq, and they were no longer willing to stay silent. The atmosphere in La Lumere restaurant was as tense as a taut string stretched to its limit. After several rounds of serving other tables and deliberately ignoring Shaq, Emma finally walked toward the corner table where he sat. In her hand was a silver tray, holding the filet mignon rossini he had ordered, a signature dish of the restaurant, priced at $350. Emma moved slowly, her high heels clicking sharply against the wooden floor, intentionally drawing the attention of every diner in the room. Her eyes betrayed an air of arrogance, and her stride seemed to declare that this was nothing more than a begrudging service for her. As she approached the table, Emma paused for a moment and placed the plate on the table with slightly more force than necessary. The faint clink of the plate meeting the table reverberated in the air. Her smile was cold and challenging. "This is what you ordered. I hope you can appreciate it," she said. Shaq, as usual, maintained his polite and composed demeanor. He glanced down at the intricately presented dish before him, then looked up at Emma. "It looks delicious, thank you," he said in a warm, courteous tone, as if he hadn't noticed the challenge in her words. Not content to let the moment end there, Emma leaned down slightly, half friendly, half intimidating. Her voice was low, but clear enough for him to hear, laced with subtle bitterness. "This dish is for connoisseurs. I'm guessing it's your first time." Shaq looked up, his eyes meeting hers, yet there was no anger or irritation in his gaze. He smiled faintly and nodded. "Thank you for the advice," he replied. Shaq's calm reaction not only unsettled Emma, but also made the onlookers feel secondhand embarrassment on her behalf. Instead of humiliating Shaq, she inadvertently exposed her own pettiness. Lisa, from a nearby table, couldn't longer keep quiet. She leaned toward her friend, her voice brimming with indignation. He just politely thanked her, and she's still being sarcastic. Unbelievable! Her friend nodded, her eyes fixed on Shaq's table. She's trying to provoke him, but I think she picked the wrong target. At the center table, Mr. and Mrs. Carter continued to watch with a serious expression. Mr. Carter lifted his wineglass, but didn't drink, his eyes following Emma's every move. "She has no idea who she's dealing with," he said, his voice low, but firm. "A man like that doesn't need to say or do anything. She'll end up embarrassing herself." Emma, unaware of the judgmental glances from other diners, straightened up again. She scanned Shaq one more time, as if looking for a sign of discomfort or annoyance, but found none. A faint sense of defeat crept into her, and to mask it, she threw out another smug remark. "If this doesn't suit your taste, we always have simpler options. Feel free to order if needed." Shaq maintained his steady smile and nodded lightly. "Thank you, I'll consider it." His composure was almost infuriating. Emma clenched the notebook in her hand tightly and turned on her heel, walking away without a backward glance. At the counter, she slammed the silver tray down, startling Jake, her colleague. "He's just pretending to be polite," she hissed, her voice dripping with frustration. "I'm sure he doesn't even know what he just ordered. People like that only come here for attention." Jake looked at her, his disapproval evident. "Maybe he just wants a peaceful dinner. Isn't it our job to serve everyone?" Emma spun around, her eyes filled with disdain. "Can't you see, Jake? He doesn't belong here, and I bet he'll leave as soon as he sees the bill." Meanwhile, Shaq began to savor the filet mignon rossini before him. The tender slices of beef paired with the foie gras and truffle sauce were a masterpiece, both in flavor and presentation. He chewed slowly, unhurried, his expression serene. Around him, the murmurs of the other diners grew louder. A few expressed their indignation on his behalf, while others merely glanced at Shaq with disapproving eyes. No one spoke out loud, but the atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted from formal elegance to an uneasy tension. Shaq, seated in the most inconspicuous corner, had become the center of attention, yet he did nothing but eat his meal calmly, gracefully, as if he was the one orchestrating the entire scene. Emma had no idea that her actions were leading her closer and closer to a lesson she would never forget. Emma had just turned her back from Shaq's table, a smug smile still lingering on her lips. She believed she had everything under control, that her delays and cutting remarks would ultimately force Shaq to leave the restaurant in silent humiliation. But what she didn't expect was how drastically the atmosphere in the restaurant would change just seconds later. From the reception desk, the restaurant manager, Mr. Thompson, emerged, a middle-aged man with a polished appearance. He strode quickly toward Shaq's table, his face marked with visible concern. His presence immediately drew the attention of nearby diners, who began glancing curiously toward the tucked-away corner of the restaurant. When Mr. Thompson reached the table, he gave a slight bow, his voice low and full of respect. "Shaq, it's such an honor to have you here. I apologize for the delay. We had no idea you were coming today." His words were like a lightning bolt, shattering the room's equilibrium. The ambient murmur of conversation abruptly ceased, leaving behind a stunned silence. Nearby customers, already intrigued, now widened their eyes in disbelief at what they'd just heard. Shaq, still calm and composed, placed his knife and fork down on the table, looking up at Mr. Thompson. He smiled warmly, his voice as smooth and kind as ever. "It's no problem. I just wanted to enjoy a quiet dinner." Across the room, Emma froze in place, tray still in hand, her vacant eyes fixed on the interaction between Shaq and Mr. Thompson. The words reverberated in her mind, shattering her earlier confidence into pieces. "Shaq? Did he just call him Shaq?" The thought swirled in her head, her mind refusing to accept the reality. Emma glanced around, noticed that every pair of eyes in the restaurant was now fixed on Shaq, and to her horror, on her as well. A young couple seated nearby whispered, their voices just loud enough for Emma to catch. "That's Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball legend. He owns stakes in so many businesses," another added. "And he's a renowned philanthropist. How could the staff here not recognize him?" The whispers spread through the restaurant like ripples in a pond. Faces that had held curiosity moments ago now showed admiration and astonishment. A few diners turned to Emma, their expressions laced with silent judgment. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. Panic and fear washed over her in waves. She stood rooted in the spot, unable to step forward or retreat. Her face paled, and her trembling hands gripped the edge of the tray as though clinging to the last remnants of her composure. Mr. Thompson turned, casting a quick glance in Emma's direction. His eyes were sharp and stern, clearly sensing the unease emanating from the surrounding diners. Shaq, still seated, picked up his glass of water and looked directly at Emma. His eyes weren't angry, but they were piercing and commanding, making her want to disappear. She knew without a doubt that her behavior had been exposed. The tension in the room thickened. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, seated at a central table, exchanged a look that was equal parts astonishment and satisfaction. Mr. Carter set down his wineglass and murmured, "I knew it. He doesn't need to say a word. His presence alone speaks volumes." From a nearby table, Lisa shook her head, her eyes filled with disappointment, as they settled on Emma. "She's ruined herself. A server who doesn't respect her guests has no place here." Shaq set his glass down and spoke softly to Mr. Thompson. "You don't need to worry. Everything's fine. But perhaps I'd like to have a brief chat with your team after dinner." Mr. Thompson immediately nodded, his expression shifting from worried to resolute. "Of course, Shaq. I'll arrange it right away." Emma felt as though the ground beneath her feet was crumbling. Shaq's words, though gentle, carried an undeniable weight. All eyes remained on her, every gaze a silent condemnation. What Emma had envisioned as a triumphant lesson to humble an unruly guest had turned into the most profound lesson of her own career.
Herself. Shaq set his glass of water down on the table, his gaze fixed squarely on Emma. His eyes didn't carry anger, but the sternness within them was enough to make her feel exposed. He leaned forward slightly, his deep, steady voice carrying a quiet authority. "Ms. Emma, what do you think about how customers should be treated?" Emma opened her mouth, but no words came out right away. She stammered as if the words were breaking apart in her mind. I didn't know who you were." Shaq shook his head slightly, his brows furrowing. His voice rang out clearly, each word cutting through the tense atmosphere in the room. "You don't need to know who I am to show me respect. Every person who walks through those doors deserves to be treated with dignity." His words echoed like a bell in the space, awakening a sense of clarity not just in Emma, but in the entire room. Some patrons nodded in agreement while others murmured among themselves, but it was evident that Shaq's words were meant for everyone. Emma felt her legs growing unsteady. She tried to respond, but every word seemed stuck in her throat. Finally, she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost inaudible, "But you're not like other customers." Shaq shook his head slightly, his brows furrowing. His voice rang out clearly, each word cutting through the tense atmosphere in the room. "You don't need to know who I am to show me respect. Every person who walks through those doors deserves to be treated with dignity." His words echoed like a bell in the space, awakening a sense of clarity not just in Emma, but in the entire room. Some patrons nodded in agreement, while others murmured among themselves, but it was evident that Shaq's words were meant for everyone. Emma felt her legs growing unsteady. She tried to respond, but every word seemed stuck in her throat. Finally, she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost inaudible, "But you're not like other customers." Shaq leaned back in his chair, his gaze remaining firm but not overly harsh. He spoke slowly, letting each word sink into Emma's mind. "It's precisely because I'm not like other customers that you need to learn to treat everyone the same. Respect isn't something you reserve for people based on how they dress, how they speak, or how they look. It's the most basic thing that every person deserves." Emma lowered her head,
her hands gripping the edge of the tray so tightly her knuckles turned white. She couldn't respond, couldn't justify herself. Every action, every word she'd spoken earlier in the evening, replayed in her memory, now haunting her. From the central table, Mr. Carter gave a subtle nod and whispered to his wife, "He doesn't need to raise his voice or assert his authority. What he said, and how he said it, was enough to teach that girl a lesson." Lisa, seated nearby, raised her glass of wine but didn't drink. Her gaze rested on Emma, her disappointment plain to see. "She'll probably remember this lesson for the rest of her life. I just hope she truly changes." Mr. Thompson, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally stepped forward. His voice was firm, but not unkind. "Emma, I think we need to have a talk after your shift, but first, let me handle this situation." Emma didn't respond, only nodded faintly, her eyes avoiding everyone's gaze. She stepped back, trying to hide her face, flushed with shame and fear. Shaq watched her retreat for a moment before turning to Mr. Thompson. His tone softened as he said, "There's no need to make this a bigger issue than it is. I believe everyone can learn from their mistakes as long as they're willing to change." His words weren't meant for Emma alone, but resonated through the entire restaurant. Some diners bowed their heads in reflection, while others nodded in agreement, acknowledging the truth in what he had said. Shaq picked up his knife and fork and resumed his meal with an air of calm, as though nothing had happened. But everyone in the restaurant knew that this calm was not indifference. It was a lesson delivered with weight and significance. change that night as everyone left the restaurant. Not only Emma, but the entire team at Lumere understood that this wasn't just a lesson for their work. It was a profound lesson about how to be better human beings. The glass door of Lumere gently closed behind Shaq, leaving the elegant space behind as the lights dimmed. The brilliant glow of the Beverly Hills streetlights illuminated his towering figure, highlighting each deliberate yet graceful step he took on the sidewalk. The stillness of the late night enveloped the surroundings, broken only by the faint rustling of the trees and the distant hum of passing cars. Shaq walked slowly, his eyes fixed on the street ahead, while his mind lingered on the events that had just unfolded. He thought about the restaurant, about Emma, the staff, and the diners who had witnessed tonight's moment. It wasn't just a lesson for one person. It was a lesson for everyone, including himself. He took a deep breath, his lips curling into a faint smile. A thought echoed in his mind, powerful and clear, just like the words he had spoken during the meeting earlier. The world needs more kindness. True strength isn't in judgment, but in acceptance. And it's the small daily choices that define who we are. Shaq knew tonight's lesson wasn't just about handling customers. It was about how we perceive each other beyond biases, beyond appearances, to see the true value in people. He thought about Emma, who made a mistake but showed genuine remorse and a commitment to change. To him, that was far more meaningful than any reprimand or punishment could ever be. Memories of his time on the basketball court suddenly came rushing back. He recalled facing criticism, the hasty judgments people made about him simply because of his playing style. He remembered how patience and calmness had helped him rise above it all. And tonight, he saw a similar moment, not on a court, but in a restaurant. As Shaq rounded a corner, the glow of a neon sign reflected off his face, accentuating his confident and composed demeanor. He knew that his actions tonight weren't about showcasing power or proving anything. They were about planting a seed for change. A change not just within Lumere, but in the way people treat each other in the wider world. He paused for a moment, turning to look back at Lumere, now dimly lit from its windows. He hoped that tonight's events wouldn't just fade into obscurity, but remain a lasting lesson for Emma, the staff, and the diners who had witnessed it. Kindness, he thought, isn't about grand gestures. It's about small, consistent choices made every day. When you choose to treat someone well, you don't just change them, you change yourself. Shaq continued walking, leaving behind the sparkling lights of Beverly Hills. The road ahead stretched endlessly, just like the message he had imparted tonight, a path leading to a world where respect and compassion aren't luxuries, but norms. And Lumere was no longer just a restaurant. It had become a symbol of hope, change, and the power of healing through the smallest acts of kindness. The story of Lumere wasn't just about a dinner. It was a profound lesson in respect and compassion, two values that should never be constrained by appearances or status. Shaquille O'Neal showed us that sometimes calmness and kindness can be the most powerful tools to challenge and change what seems unchangeable. What do you think about tonight's lesson? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a similar situation where kindness and understanding shattered prejudice? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share it to spread the message, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss out on more meaningful stories. See you in the next video.